Hello there, and welcome to the return of a series I haven't done in quite some time, the Patron Q&A. I'm going to be answering some questions from the patrons, first on Star Wars, then there's also some questions about modding that'll be towards the end of the video, but this is basically a way to kind of help thank the people who make it possible for me to have content creation as my full-time job, whether they are patrons over on patreon.com/CoreyLoses or channel members here on YouTube for the future iterations. I will do a members only post for people to get in questions from that as well. The hope is to do it about every month. I'm going to try it obviously this month in August, then I'll do one in September, and we'll see what demand looks like. Then I'll make it more or less common as questions are common. If they sometimes just end up being shorter, that's another option as well. But we have quite a few questions to go through this time. Again, I will be starting off with questions that are more generally related to Star Wars. And then at the end, I'll have a section that is more focused specifically on questions people had about the Empire War Expanded mods that I work on, since there were a few questions specifically about that. But our first question comes from Reebox, who says, the Warlords and Empire Proper's leaders had many different authors and Atlas-type books that expanded and grew their characters and stories. Which of them do you think got the best overall character development and narrative, and which of them do you feel are more cookie-cutter? Thanks, Corey, for bringing this back. Hopefully my question makes sense. It does make sense. Thank you, Reebox. So I think Thrawn gets the most coverage. There's a lot to kind of say about how his story kind of develops and how even Timothy Zahn treats him differently over time. But obviously going from a character who started in books, went to animation, and is now in live action, if you look across both continuities, I think like he's easily got the most development, and I think is partially because he is an interesting character. And then you have some of the other like book characters right below that. They're like Isard or Dala. Dala gets a lot of development over many books, but she hadn't made the same jump that Thrawn has. Uh, but a lot of the warlords, like aside from Warlord Zinj, if you're looking uh, outside of the kind of main empire leaders to like the splinter warlords, most of them get basically nothing in like actual storytelling. So you get in Darksaber, a couple of them get a bit more attention. So that's where a lot of the warlords get introduced, but they don't have much that happens with them. They just kind of get introduced and killed off. And a lot of the actual story of fleshing out how the galaxy looked after Endor and how a lot of those characters worked were just kind of uh, like the Atlas type books or the source books that gave them a little bit more backstory at a time. Like the Pentastar alignment and Artist Kane, despite being theoretically like in universe such a big deal, out of universe, you get maybe like two little blurbs about them. They're really not this big fleshed out part of a narrative. They're just kind of cookie cutter. We have these names, we're going to put them here. And then like some of them, the names even just came from source books expanding on stuff that might have happened. So like Kane is probably, if you look at impact in universe relative to uh like actual coverage and stories, I think Kane and the Pentastar alignment have to be kind of the opposite end of the scale from someone like Thrawn or Dala, who have a lot of impact in universe, but also like such a bigger presence in stories. Like Zinj is really the only warlord that has like an actual novel about him or a set of novels with X-Wing and Courtship of Princess Leia. But uh but yeah, I think like Kane's like right at the bottom. Then Pterodok and Harsk and Delvardis are right above him. And then you have like Zinj. Then above that, you have your Throns, your Dallas, Isard, even Pelion, of course. If you want to think of him as like a warlord character. But interesting question. I do have a video planned specifically on some of those characters coming up soon. But thank you, Reeboks. Our next question is from Nicholas Kaiser, who asks, since you've been slowly rereading Legends novels on the Tapcaf podcast, how has rereading these books changed your perspective on any aspect of Star Wars history in or out of universe? So this is something that I actually think about a fair bit with doing videos compared to not doing videos, where like when I originally read most of these books, it was before university, where I took history and poli sci, and I was much younger, and I wasn't like mining them for content or whatever I do now. So I wasn't analyzing them the same way. Like I've always kind of talked about how I enjoy Jason's story over line. I Jason Solo is my favorite Star Wars character, and that like he has my favorite arc. Uh, which there's a bit of nuance to that in that I don't necessarily like what they do with his character at the end, but I like looking at it from the perspective of what in his past made him do the things he does. Which is like a whole. It's like, choosing in a vacuum, I wouldn't have made those choices with his character that Troy Denning does, of, like, making him a Sith Lord, having Vergier actually be a Sith, but I do think, like, kind of looking at the trauma of the Yuuzhan Vong War and some of the decisions he makes even in the Yuuzhan Vong War about, like, what what is his right to do, uh, and how, like, Vergier encourages some of that. I do think, like, looking at how that can make someone go to the dark side is interesting, and I think, like, as an overall character arc, that stands out to me the most, even though the things that, like, make me like Jason as a character are from the earlier parts of the Yuuzhan Vong War and, like, Young Jedi Knights, because like, growing up, uh, reading like, I got into Star Wars a little bit later, but, like, I was still kind of in the right range to go back and read Young Jedi Knights, and, like, Jason became my favorite character from that. So, like, kind of looking at that was very different for me going back again, because now I have people, like, questioning my choice about that, so I have to explain it more thoroughly, and I haven't actually done that yet, but, like, I haven't done, like, a full analysis of the character or which parts I do or don't like. Like, a lot of Legacy of the Force, I don't actually like the choices that were made specifically, or Dark Nest especially, but like, I do think about them differently and try to present how I think about them differently in a way that I didn't really have to before. Uh, and also just doing like the political or historical analysis with like the videos is kind of a medium for that. Like, I think there's interesting things to look at with the historical context of how the books were written or why they were written, what the authors might have been trying to say, what context that they might not have been trying to bring in, but which did kind of seep into the books. I find all that stuff really interesting in a way that I wasn't like as aware of or uh, looking for in the same way when I was younger. But I think the way I kind of engage with Star Wars is very different than when I initially kind of got into it. But thank you, Nicholas. I hope that answered your question. The next question also relates to Star Wars and the expanded universe, more generally like that, and that is what was happening behind it. This is from Borsk81, not to be confused with Dorsk81. No copyright infringement intended. Borsk81 wants to know what was happening behind the scenes of the expanded universe. Did writers talk to each other? This kind of depends on the authors in the eras. Like, notably, Timothy Zahn, Michael Stackpole, and Aaron Alston were kind of like one tighter group together, and then you had like Kevin J. Anderson and Rebecca Moista, and you had like people more around that with like Barbara Hambly and that kind of thing. Uh, so like there were Timothy Zahn, notably when he started writing the Thrawn trilogy, he didn't want to engage with Dark Empire, the comics that had just come out or that were going to be coming out, because like originally the books were supposed to be set after Dark Empire, the Thrawn trilogy, and like take into account some of what happened there. But Timothy Zahn wasn't into that idea very much. He always kind of found the idea of like broader canon more constricting, and I think this does come through even in his like other work where he's more inclined to play with his own toys than others, the exception there being like specific collaborations with Michael Stackpole, for example, where like Cortosis was something that um, Timothy Zahn came up with. No, Michael Stackpole came up with it. One of them came. I did a video about this recently, but I don't remember the details exactly. All right, so I went and double checked this to make sure I was saying the right thing. With Cortosis in I Jedi and Vision of the Future, Timothy Zahn actually came up with it, wanted to use it in Vision of the Future, and told Michael Stackpole about it, who kind of wrote it into I Jedi with a bit more depth than Timothy Zahn was planning to kind of go into on the subject. And then that got brought back up in Vision of the Future. So there was some cooperation there, but there was less of an idea of like everything had to fit together. Like, a lot of the books in the Bantam era were kind of written independently at the same time, covering a bigger, broader set of topics, and like less was allowed to change, so it mattered less because like it was kind of warlord or adventure of the week. But there were things that kind of get brought up as like author wars within Bantam. And while there are decisions that were definitely made by some authors that others did not agree with, or choices made by uh, the publishing side that specific authors didn't agree with, again, like Mara Jade and Gilad Pelion being killed. Timothy Zahn wasn't happy about that. And I'd like Timothy Zahn generally didn't like the idea of Star Wars going as dark as it did in the New Jedi Order. Uh, so like there was definitely some contention in some of those things, but like there are other things that get pointed out as evidence of like some deep-seated hatred between like him and Kevin J. Anderson, which I think gets significantly overstated. People kind of point to the whole Mara and Luke situation or Mara and Callista and say that like the authors were going in competing directions there. But I think Kevin J. Anderson even recently tweeted about the fact that like he had asked Timothy Zahn if the intention was for Luke and Mara to be together, and Zan said no. So that's why Kevin J. Anderson didn't go that direction. So like there's some interesting stuff that happened behind the scenes, but it's not quite as contentious as I think or salacious as it's often presented. But thank you, Boris. Hope that answered your question as well. Um, so, next question comes from the sheriff who asks, "What is the efficacy of super ships in fleet doctrine? Well, obviously not great when used as patrol craft. The Warlord era, Rasan reformations, and New Republic era also make or all make a good argument, in my opinion, for their usage as backup or reinforcements." I mean, that one's kind of hard to say because, like, in universe, it just kind of fluctuates, and like it's a lot of resources to put into one thing, like one big target that then just gets shut down most of the time. Like, I did a breakdown of like all the super ships the Empire had, and more than half of them were destroyed by one guy in a fighter exploding their from the hangar with a tie bomber. So they don't really accomplish all that much. They get a better record in universe a bit later on, especially with the Yuzon Vong War. But their attrition rate is higher than for other ships. So I mean, I wouldn't personally invest in them. They're very vulnerable to bombers. But then you have the counterpoint of like the Battle of Arinda, where the carriers get blown up by the super ships and the Republic goes further in that direction. So it does fluctuate a bit. But and it kind of ends up depending what the faction's trying to do with their fleet, whether or not it ends up working out. Like I personally wouldn't build a lot of them. But hopefully that answers your question, the sheriff. It's a bit more of a in universe subjective opinion. So it's harder to give a solid answer there. But Lissy is asking, what's your favorite force technique and lightsaber fighting style? I mean, force lightning is always cool. Like any Star Wars game that I can play with force lightning, I end up using force lightning. I always like using like the dual lightsaber setup. So some Jarkai is I guess my favorite. But in Jedi Survivor, I went in thinking that I'd really like the dual lightsabers. I ended up using either double bladed or the kind of fencing style uh, with the pistol. So I think overall though, Jarkai is still my favorite. Like I think it looks coolest. I think it looks like the danciest. So I don't like it when both people have two lightsabers if you're watching a duel because that's too much. There's like four lightsabers, two people. That's too high of a ratio. Like 1.5 lightsabers across two people. That's great. Or average across two people. That's great. Like you get to Grievous and you have like Obi-Wan with one, Grievous with four. Like even George Lucas decided that was too much and like two get cut off right away. So like if you have 5-2 lightsaber ratio, that's too much. Like you want to stay like one regular. What someone's got to have a regular single blade lightsaber. Someone else has like a saber staff or two sabers. If you really want to stretch it, then we can have two lightsabers against a saber staff, and I think that's right on the cusp of getting to be too much. Uh, but like the and with Force Lightning, it's just if I'm playing KOTOR, I'm getting down to Force Storm all the time. If I'm playing Jedi Academy, Force Lightning used a lot. Like Grip is the Force Grip or Choke. That's a bit too crude. Lightning is always cool though, so it's impossible to go wrong with Lightning. Thank you, Lizzie. The next question is from David Foe, who's asking, what is a Star Wars game you feel is overrated, and what game do you feel is underrated? So I'm gonna go. I have a classic answer and a modern answer for the underrated. I'm gonna go with that first. For classic Star Wars games that I think are underrated, I'm gonna say Jedi Academy. I think it gets overshadowed by Jedi Outcast too much, and I think both of them, for their period, or I guess a little later, they get uh, less appreciation than Battlefront 2 and Republic Commando. We'll get back to that. Modern Star Wars games, like my favorite Star Wars game is Star Wars Squadrons. The most fun I have had playing a Star Wars game was in like the tournaments we did for Star Wars Squadrons. People counter this by saying, "Oh, it's just a MOBA or something." I don't like that. It's like, well, I do like that. But like, I had such high expectations for that game. Uh, and then, like, playing it for the first time, it did not disappoint me, especially when I got into multiplayer. Like, I love that kind of uh, team coordination based multiplayer game, and I think that's something Star Wars hasn't really had much of otherwise. Like, I really wish that game had more support and like kept getting patches because like it was a double A project made by people who very clearly were passionate about making that game and like convinced EA to go for it. But EA was never going to put that much investment into it, and it was definitely a more niche title. Partially as a result of that, partially because of the focus of it. Even though like a lot of those kinds of games can be quite popular. So I think maybe with some more investment from EA, maybe it could have gone differently. But I absolutely love Squadrons, and someday I'm hoping we'll be able to do more multiplayer Squadrons action. Uh, but for overrated, I kind of hinted at this already with the Jedi Outcast and Jedi Academy talk. I I don't think Republic Commando or Battlefront 2, the original Battlefront 2, were particularly good like relative to other games of their type at the time they came out. Like I don't have the same nostalgia for them. Like I at least I do have the nostalgia for the original Battlefront one, misplaced as that may be, but the like Republic Commando, I think like the enemies are too bullet spongy. I don't think the actual gunplay is all that interesting. And the thing that it gets kind of held up for of like the squad based tactical combat, you you kind of don't do much with that. Like you can tell a person to go to a position, but it's always like there's not different ways to approach a situation because of that. It's like two spots you can set them up at. And then even though they emphasize the roles of the characters in the squad, you can't tell a specific person to go to a specific place and they all kind of do the same thing. So like there's not that much depth to that. So there's like, whenever I go back and play Republic Commando, I'm not as into it, and it's kinda the same thing with Battlefront 2, where, like, if you look at other shooters that came out around the same time, I think other games were just better at the time. Uh, then, like, if you remove I think modding gives, especially Battlefront 2, a lot more staying power for some people, but, like, I don't it doesn't hold that same space to me mentally. But yeah, there's my that whenever I give that answer, it usually gets a lot of angry responses, but that's how I feel. So thank you, David. Our next sorry, our next Star Wars question comes from Garrist, who asked, if Lucas never sold to Disney, where do you think the franchise would have gone? Further outsourcing, some sort of Lucasfilm live action show or movie, inevitable buyout from Disney or another megacore. I'll ask another question. So this is kind of followed up by a similar bit of clarification, I guess. Do you think the reappraisal of the prequels would have given a still at the helm George Lucas the ego boost needed to make another movie? I assume he would see all of his director friends like Scorsese pulling out hits and possibly could have followed their lead. I don't think the reappraisal was necessary for Lucas to make another movie. I think he was slowly moving in that direction, but like the things that made him sell were still there. Like he did not enjoy going through that response, and I think he knew no matter what he did, the same response would come. Like I think no matter what you make, you will have that contingent of people who uh, dislike it for different reasons, valid or not. And like I think the some of the reappraisal that comes for the prequels is kind of the same thing that like every bit of Star Wars has always had, where like when the next thing comes, it leads to a reappraisal of the prior thing because some of the energy gets taken away from it. Where like if you look at the general populace, they're not seeing the prequels any differently than people did like 10, 20 years ago, other than the fact that you have the younger people who got introduced to Star Wars with the prequels being older now. And so like a bunch of 8-year-olds in 2000 like myself weren't going to be engaging in the online conversation the way that a lot of adults were who didn't like the movies as much. And like if you talk to a lot of people there, you go to like more normal media spaces and a lot of them are still making prequel jokes, even if like the more dedicated fan base has kind of either reevaluated them as better or at least kind of decided like to be nicer to the people involved in making them and realize that that was not a healthy environment for anyone to be in. It was not healthy for the actors like Jake Lloyd and Ahmed Best. It was something that like easily would have turned off some of the other actors as well, who just didn't want anything to do with Star Wars for a while. And like I think the sequels coming out contributed to people uh, looking back on the prequels a different way, in the same way that when the new Jedi Order books came out, people talked about Bantam more collectively and had like a more positive opinion of that and a worse opinion of the new Jedi Order. But then people like me would come along where New Jedi Order was kind of what got me into Star Wars. So I had a different opinion on that versus like the Bantam books. And then you kind of had the same thing happening with uh, Dark Nest coming out, and then Legacy of the Force and Fate of the Jedi, where these were all kind of seen as distinct eras that had their own like people who said everything before here counts and everything after here does not. And this happens with everything. Like you can go to the old Thrawn's Revenge forums and you like these discussions have always happened and they kind of always will happen. Uh so like I do think eventually George Lucas was going to sell. He's like aging happens to everyone. He would have retired at some point. Maybe he would have had more involvement in some stuff. Maybe the reaction to his version of the sequels would have been better or worse. We don't know. Uh, but like, I think ultimately he would have been done with it at some point. He seems much happier in his retirement. And like, he'll still pop in on like some sets sometimes, but I think he's happier that way. Like, he didn't direct the other like the rest of the original trilogy. He directed one of them. So like he was always looking to give over some of that control to other people, even if he kept like overall control of the series. And like a lot of the people working on Star Wars now are the same people who worked on Star Wars when George Lucas owned Lucasfilm versus Disney. Like Dave Filoni was already someone that he was kind of training up for the position that Dave Filoni is still in. So like whatever people feel about Dave Filoni's work, whether positively or negatively, Dave Filoni was going to have that level of influence, most likely either way. And it's kind of the thing that, like, when it comes to specific creative decisions, like, I don't think anyone who says, like, oh, Disney needs to sell Lucasfilm or needs to sell Star Wars really consider the fact that like it's going to be the same people working on the actual creative decisions, because like there was a lot of continuity between Lucasfilm and Disney in that way. The biggest disconnect was with LucasArts versus like Lucasfilm Games now, where LucasArts was in a lot of trouble before the buyout, and then the buyout was kind of what made them kind of just cut the cord there. Like there would have been more games that came out in that time period, the early time period, because there were some that were like almost done, like First Assault or First Strike, whatever it was called, the multiplayer one, which I probably would have loved. That were farther along, but also some other ones that were earlier on, which would have had probably a similar chance to get canceled. Because like if you look at the Battlefront 3 situation, if you look at like Force Unleashed 3, potential for Empire at War 2, all that kind of stuff, a lot of those were canceled beforehand and were in kind of a development hell because like between 2008 2012ish, LucasArts was not in a good place. So I think some of the stuff that happened would have happened anyways. I don't know that the reappraisal would have been all that different, but i I also don't think like the end result would have been all that different either, regardless of how people feel about that positively or negatively. But thank you, Garrus. Hope that was Hope that response made sense as well. I know I went off on a few other tangents there. Okay, there's one more Star Wars questions here, or directly Star Wars question from Pyro Mercenary, asking how much do you enjoy discussing Star Wars compared to simply enjoying it? Like for me, I like doing media analysis kind of stuff. Uh, so like having people to talk about stuff with, I think is what I really enjoy. Uh, so like even if I'm reading a book or something on my own, I'll try to get like other people into it as I've done with Worm. And like I was like put into stuff by other friends. Like my friend introduced me to Worm and now I'm trying to make everyone else read it. And like the way I typically think about media is I'll like think about like character motivations more. Like that's what I kind of find interesting. That's what I kind of find fun about stories. Uh, so I think talking about Star Wars or talking about any media, there is a greater push to talk about whether or not something is good. Uh, and sometimes that leads into kind of turning, was this what you wanted out of it or not? And that kind of factors into whether or not it's good. So that's probably the biggest thing between like if I were just enjoying something on my own versus talking about it, like in this kind of context, is that I probably end up having to spend more time converting the thoughts I have on something into some kind of like expressing an opinion on whether or not it's good than I, or like exactly where it might fit on a scale of goodness than I really do if I'm enjoying it on my own. Like for me, if it's like if I'm doing it on my own, then I will read it. If I am in some way enjoying it, I will continue. If I am not enjoying it, I'll just stop. And then I probably won't discuss it very much. So, like, if I'm talking about movies with my friends, maybe like with Marvel or something where we're watching a bunch of slop at the same time, then we'll talk about like whether we liked it more or less than the other ones, or maybe we'll call it bad or good. But like, I don't like, we don't like rank it the same way that I end up kind of having to think about it when engaging with media this way. So, that's probably the least fun part about doing like talking about Star Wars in this way rather than just how I think about it on my own. But like having a community built up that are like actively discussing different parts of these things, talking about like why certain choices might have been made, what they might have enjoyed more. I do find that really fun. So like I get more, probably more value out of like talking about it this way than not, even if there is that one caveat of like now I have to think about or express how good or bad I think someone is if I want slightly fewer angry comments. Then at least I'll only get angry comments about where I classified it rather than that I'm like hiding my opinion, which isn't really what I'm trying to do. But thank you, Pyro. We have, so I'm going to do a lot of modding related questions now. There were a few on that. So if you're not familiar with the Empire at War expanded mods for Empire at War, that's a thing that I work on as well. And yeah, so there's some questions we'll do now. So the first question is from Joseph Burbank, who asks, "What's something you'd like to show in the future for either Fall of the Republic or Revenge Revenge as a story conquest, government mechanic, a unit, or something different?" Uh, so I'll kind of take this as what I'd like to work on most in the future, because otherwise it's just spoiling announcements. Uh, there's nothing specific that we have done already that I am looking forward to announcing specifically, but I am really looking forward to getting back to having raid fleets of some kind, like three-way battles that can happen organically in Galactic Conquest. And I think three-way battles in space are fun. I really like the final story mission of Empire at War, like or Forces of Corruption's campaign, the Underworld campaign or Zan Consortium campaign. So having that back in some way, in a way that's not just like the random spawns and what we used to have for raid fleets, I think that'll be a lot of fun. Thank you, Joseph. The next questions come from Johan, who asks, "Will there ever be a faction in Thrawn's Revenge where we'd be able to choose the ships and troops we like to fight with?" There's a little bit of this with the custom Galactic Conquest, but like there would be so much back end scripting for that that is just like super cumbersome, makes the game laggier in every situation, not just where you're doing that. And it like it it would be pretty messy. So if you really want a fully custom roster in a faction, you kind of got to get into submodding and kind of build it yourself. It'll be easier than and less overhead than us doing that. And Empire at War's UI doesn't really support that in the same way. So us trying to like shove it in makes less sense than people kind of learning some mod on their own for it. But the second question from Johan is, could you make it possible for or to choose a faction between the hypervelocity gun or ion cannon as a ground to space defense? Not really. Those are kind of like indexed in a weird way. So there's a lot of limitations on how the ground to space weapons work that don't apply elsewhere. So we're unfortunately pretty stuck on how those work. Uh, so kind of simpler technical questions there. Unfortunately, probably not the answers you were looking for, but thank you, Johan. The next question comes from Shane, who says, I just watched the Sith Rule of Two Government Mechanic video. Very neat idea. However, is it possible to include a mini civil war with the faction leader shakeup? Thing like the breakaway factions in TR with Harsk and Krenel, which could mimic said leader taking ships, troops, and a couple planets with them. Would be kind of accurate to the Sith being their own worst enemies and stabbing their fellows in the back. More curious in if the concept is possible in the mod, and if so, how it would be coded in. So you can have that kind of thing happen. You can just have like planets randomly switch, but usually we avoid doing that because it discourages players from building up planets if you know you're going to just randomly lose them. And it also discourages players from engaging with that kind of mechanic. It just makes the whole thing feel much worse if you're losing that much progress. Like taking planets the is progress for the game. So we try to avoid situations where we're just dropping that, especially because we are trying to make sure players want to build up their territory. There are some situations where it does still apply, but we've limited that as much as possible. And we usually try to make it avoidable. And like we just if we want players to feel like they can switch between Sith Lords, then that's basically a way to make the mechanic only feel bad. So it's not something that we'd really be considering there. There are some situations where there will be like Sith Civil Wars going on the map because like that kind of happened after the Jedi Civil War happened, like before Kreia took power. But that's more of like how certain galactic conquests, especially the Dark Wars galactic conquest, will start rather than having your faction get halfway through the game and then just splinter into a bunch of pieces. So yeah, like it's technically very easy to do, especially with some of the tools that we've coded in, where it's just like a call to switch a random planet. You can do that pretty easily, but like gameplay wise, it ends up sounding cooler in theory to have things split off like that than it actually ends up being in practice. But thank you, Shane. Our next question comes from Kiva, who asks, what was the inspiration for Empire War Expanded ground vehicles and units that have almost no lore to draw from? For example, ground rosters for the Hapens, Hiruvi, Killik, Chiss, and Duskin League factions. It kind of depends like who's working on them or what the faction is. Like Ruby is easy to design for because they have a very clear aesthetic, and there's sometimes like some factions where there'll be like a picture of something, and then we just run wild with whatever is tied to that. For like the Hapens, for example, with the battle dragons being kind of uh, shaped like a shell, and with the Nova cruisers being shaped kind of avian like, then like birds and fish turned into a big inspiration for how our Hapen units look. So like the Mist Carrier, you have some kind of like jellyfish look to that, much like the Star Home has. You have like bird designs for their like bird influence designs for some of the ground units. So it's kind of just like aquatic and avian life comes in there. So it really depends on the situation and the faction and what's established there. Like one of the first things you kind of do is try to figure out what are the common design elements for a faction, and then you make a bunch of variants on that based on what the faction needs. Killix are easy because it's like the whole faction is bugs. We have decent pictures of what the bugs look like in some of their subspecies, and then Philoraptor is just going to be taking those ideas and making bigger or smaller ones. And like, luckily, different bug types exist that we can kind of take inspiration from. In space, they're just asteroids that the bugs have spit on. That makes that easier too. But yeah, it's very dependent on like the context. You try to find what ties the faction together and lean into that while still trying to make sure that everything is like readable and distinct within the faction, because you want a bunch of different silhouettes, because people are generally looking at like the general shape of what they're clicking on, and uh that's how you kind of know at a glance what all your stuff does. But thank you, Kiva. Our next question comes from Lars, who asks, first, how do you manage to keep your motivation with Empire at War when you play it all the time. So that can kind of depend on the time period. Like I try to work in some other stuff so that I'm not playing and testing Empire at War all the time. But like in a certain sense, Empire at War, like playing Empire at War for my gaming channel, Corey Loses, is my job. And it's like the biggest thing that has like the biggest reward for Patreon tied to it. It's the most consistent videos that I put out that do reasonably well. So as far as jobs go, like playing Empire at War fairly regularly, a couple times a week, is much better than a lot of jobs I've had in the past, even at times when I've like played too much Empire at War in a period. So I try to just balance it out like that. Uh, if I can like record in advance, and that'll give me like a nice week break from the game, then I'm usually interested when I come back. But like what also helps is that since I mod Empire at War, it can like I'll think about like what I want to change about it as well. And then that makes each playthrough kind of feel a bit more fresh because I've like addressed what my modern problems with the game might be. Uh, Even if like, yeah, it's nice to work in some other stuff sometimes. So in a perfect world, would I be able to like work in other Star Wars games or just other strategy games and have them do equally as well as Empire at War? Yeah, that might be nice if I can do like a Total War campaign and then an Empire at War campaign without it being a huge difference in performance. Stellaris is the closest that's ever come, but Empire at War is still like my favorite in that category. So I mean, it works out well for me. I'm not. It's kind of just making sure I'm not like doing 5 streams a week of Empire at War. That would be too much. And I think that's kind of what burnt Eck out on Empire at War when he was doing it, where he'd do his campaigns as like longer streams closer together, where I'm still trying to do like I'll play once or twice a week, break those down into the episodes, and then I'm not overdoing it that way. It's pacing myself. Pacing yourself is important. But thank you, Lars. Lars does have another question saying mods like Awakening and Rebellion do similar things to Empire War X. Do you and your team pay attention to them, talk to their devs, or even take inspiration from them? Mod wise, no, not like looking at their mechanics and thinking like, oh, like talking to each other about mechanics. Um, I've said it in a few of the recent playthroughs where like I haven't played other mods in a long time, because then like if when mods end up doing things that are too similar, it ends up turning into like, oh, you stole this from here, you stole this from here, and that's just easier to avoid. Uh, but like usually mods will communicate about like technical side of things. So like how does stuff work in the game and how can you use that to get around certain issues? With that, we do communicate pretty regularly. Like there's a modding server, Discord server where like everyone kind of communicates about that kind of thing. But it's rarely, oh, here's a mechanic we can all do. Uh, so that kind of thing is usually like done within a specific team. And then with the patches that Petroglyph makes, those tend to be like a bunch of us are working with Petroglyph on that, like giving ideas on what modders want to see. Like a bunch of modders from basically every team are involved when that happens, and then we'll all kind of like talk to each other about like what are the benefits or drawbacks of doing change A over change B, what kind of things might be possible. So, uh, so like yeah, it's less about uh here's a mechanic we can all do, unless there's like specific agreements between different mods where they're more directly working together. With like remake and Awakening of the Rebellion for a while, I don't know what the if they're still working as directly together, but like they were uh those teams were a lot more integrated because there were some similar goals they were working on and there was a lot of assets changed there. um Whereas like Empire War Expanded is like we'll talk to people about like here's the thing that impacts performance. Here's other ways you can work around that. Like that kind of thing is more common than uh getting content designed together. There are certain just factors in the game that make us come to similar decisions about stuff because we're all kind of working within the same constraints, but it's rarely because we've all talked about like, oh, this is how we should handle this type of balancing. But thank you, Lars, for both questions. And I think I'm just going to do a quick glance over and see if there were anything else I missed. Uh, no, I think that got everything. So thanks to everyone who submitted questions. Again, thank you specifically to all the patrons, channel members, everyone watching as well. If you'd like to join the Patreon, get a question in here, and support the channel in that way in the future, or become a channel member. That's very appreciated. There'll be a link in the description. Uh, but I will put the next question list up when this video is going up. So that'll be available there, and those will be answered in September. Then, depending on how many questions there are, we'll see if we do an October one, maybe a November one. And yeah, so thanks again for watching, and hope to see you next time. Bye, everyone.